Welcome to part 2 of my 20 underrated 2000s hip-hop albums. I hope everybody got a good chance to digest part 1, as now we get into the albums that I think are the most underrated on this list. Again, the format here is that I'm counting these down from what I think are the least underrated to the most underrated. There was also lots to choose from here in the 2000s, so there's probably a strong chance that you won't see your personal picks on here, but as always, I would love to discuss in the comments what you think should have made this list. Alright, so let's jump right back in. If you know my taste, you know that I love Memphis rap and I love 3 6 Mafia. While the best work that 3 6 Mafia did kind of as a group was in the 90s, associated artists like Project Pat were up next in the 2000s, and for number 10 on this list, I'm going to talk about Pat's second album, 2001's Mr. Don't Play. This is an album that I've been spinning in some way, shape, or form basically since it came out in early 2001. I actually remember in 7th grade science class, a buddy of mine who sat right next to me, we would sit there and we would actually recite the chorus from Chickenhead live in science class. And while Chickenhead was the lead single and mainstream appeal for Mr. Don't Play, it wasn't really indicative of how dark, atmospheric, and menacing that this record really is. And it's on this record that Project Pat hits us with his signature lyrical style, where he kind of picks certain syllables and focuses his rhymes on this unorthodox delivery, sometimes even creating like new parts of a word to help the passage rhyme. For instance, on the song Whole Lotta Weed, he drops lines like, "Maybe it's not your timer, maybe it could be minor, then put me in a box and bury me with my niner." So this album is punctuated with these awesome rhyme schemes, and there are plenty of guest appearances from other 3 6 Mafia members, with DJ Paul and Juicy J in particular showing up on the song If You Ain't From My Hood, which features a great beat switch in the middle. There are some truly hardcore songs here, including Cheese and Dope, We Can Get Gangsta, and the chilling Aggravated Robbery. And overall, just Project Pat pulls no punches and drops one of the most furious efforts of his career. The aura is just spooky and ominous, the production from DJ Paul and Juicy J is absolutely on point, and this overall is one of Project Pat's most complete records. I've seen this one get shoved under the rug a little bit in favor of his debut 1999 album Getty Green, as well as other 3 6 Mafia and 3 6 Mafia adjacent releases from the time, but it's Mr. Don't Play that's a little underrated for my taste, and I think the album overall deserves more attention. Number 9 on my list is the debut album of a rapper that I briefly mentioned in part 1, and that's Cormega. A Queensbridge legend that came up alongside Mobb Deep and Nas, Cormega was actually immortalized on the song One Love from Nas's 1994 classic Illmatic, as the premise of the song is Nas writing a letter to a couple of his friends who were incarcerated. So while Cormega wasn't there for that explosion of Queensbridge hip-hop in 1994 and 1995, he actually came home a little bit later in the 90s and had a brief stint with the supergroup The Firm before being replaced by fellow Queensbridge rapper Nature, which led to a conflict between Cormega, Nature, and actually Nas, who was in the group as well. So by the summer of 2001, Cormega kind of put all this behind him and released his debut album, and it was immediately well received in the underground hip-hop community. He employed a roster of talented producers, including Mobb Deep's Havoc, The Alchemist, and Godfather Don, to give him beats that sounded modern but also not too polished, and he kept a lot of that street grit that makes Queensbridge hip-hop so good. This is actually perfect as Cormega tells some really gritty street tales throughout the realness, but he did it on this album in a way that was more thoughtful and poetic than pretty much any rapper from Queensbridge at that time except for maybe Nas. He kicks the album off with the songs Dramatic Entry and American Beauty, which set the stage for a lyrical clinic, and I think the most well-known song here on the realness is Thun and Kicka, which features Prodigy of Mobb Deep, and Cormega actually had a guest spot on Prodigy's HNIC, which was released a year before the realness. The rest of the album features more morose, poetic street tales as he pays tribute to his friends on Fallen Soldiers, and he tells his own personal story on the Majestic, The Saga. Get Out My Way and You Don't Want It show just how aggressive Cormega could actually be on the mic, but again, he never really compromises his verbal poise and brings a strong sense of intellect to his writing and his rhymes. While Cormega did generate a pretty good amount of buzz when he first came out in the early 2000s, I don't think he's a rapper that today people acknowledge as one of the greats, and I don't think that's right. He's in my top 10 rappers of all time, and while you know that I do have an inclination for Queensbridge rappers, I simply do not think Cormega gets his flowers the way he should, and I do think this album is his finest work and is a perfect example of why Cormega is a special artist. He would go on to release a number of heralded albums in the 2000s and even into the 2010s, but The Realness is an unbelievable debut and one of the grittiest hip-hop albums of the 2000s. The next entry on my list is by an artist that undisputedly flies under the radar. Vakill is a rapper from Chicago that was active in the 90s and 2000s with his crew, the Mole Men, and he would begin his solo career in 2003 with the album The Darkest Cloud, which is his debut album and the number 8 album on my list. For those of you who may not be familiar with Vakill, he's got some of the most potent wordplay and lyrical skill when compared with pretty much any artist on this list. He combines this on The Darkest Cloud with some unbelievable beats from members of the Mole Men crew, including producers Panic and Memo. And really the formula on The Darkest Cloud is nothing more than that, a sharp-as-nails rapper with some killer underground production. This results in some incredible songs like the battle rap heavy Sick Simplicity, the underground sensation track The Creed, and the apocalyptic Till the World Blows Up. Another standout here is the song Fallen, where Vakill actually shares the stage with rapper Slug from Atmosphere. Vakill plays the part of a rapper who has been dropped from his record label, basically goes postal, kills record execs, holds other record execs hostage, before running into Slug, who is the hostage negotiator. This is a great concept track with some awesome back and forth action, and it's actually one of the more memorable songs I've heard from the 2000s underground. Vakill would have a pretty respectable underground career through the 2000s, but The Darkest Cloud is the best showcase of just how hungry of a rapper he was, trying to break out of a city where names like Kanye West and Lupe Fiasco were representing on a mainstream level. Vakill overall is an amazing rapper, and this is a fantastic debut album that I cannot recommend enough. In part 1, I mentioned the Army of the Pharaohs collective and their 2006 debut album, The Torture Papers. The collective was unofficially led by Vinnie Paz, who's the frontman of Jedi Mind, and it turns out that in 2006, his work on The Torture Papers wasn't the only thing he had his hand in as far as underrated 2000s hip-hop albums. So for number 7 on my list, I'm going to focus on the 5th album from Jedi Mind Tricks, 2006's Servants in Heaven, Kings in Hell, which I think is one of their finest records. So I'll be brutally honest, pretty much all of Jedi Mind Tricks' work lives in the shadow of their 2000 album Violent by Design, which was a vulgar, militant underground classic where pretty much every bar just spun the head of the listener around, and every beat was fantastic. So Vinnie Paz and producer Stoop the Enemy of Mankind of Jedi Mind Tricks, who were the two most consistent members of the group throughout its iteration, could never quite put out anything that lived up to Violent by Design, but Servants in Heaven, Kings in Hell comes pretty damn close. There are a lot of Vinnie Paz's patented battle raps here, like Put 'Em in the Grave and Serenity and Murder, as well as the lead single Heavy Metal Kings, but this is the first album where Vinnie Paz starts to really get a little bit more personal and stops focusing so much on destroying the opposition. There are strong political undertones on songs like Shadow Business, and his collaboration with R.A. the Rugged Man on the song Uncommon Valor, Vietnam's story tells the horrors of the Vietnam War. R.A. the Rugged Man provides one of the most legendary guest appearances in hip-hop history here, and it actually comes from the perspective of his father, who did contract Agent Orange while in Vietnam, which led to a very painful and challenging rest of his life. I think Razorblade Salvation, the 12th track, is one of Jedi Mind Tricks' finest songs of all time, as Vinnie Paz tells some extremely personal family stories and even touches on his mental health over just a fantastic piano loop from Stoop. And in Jedi Mind Tricks' discography as a whole, this is kind of one of the first times that we see Vinnie Paz getting really truly deep and emotional, and even with his usual kind of tough guy persona on the mic, this vulnerable side actually really works. Jedi Mind Tricks are seen as one of the most consistent and successful underground hip-hop acts of the 2000s, and they do have a bit of a cult following even today. But in my eyes, this 5th album should be held almost in the same vein as Violent by Design, as this album is a near classic in my book. I really don't think that Violent by Design has aged so well. There's some really transgressive subject material on there, and you don't get nearly as much of that on Servants in Heaven, Kings in Hell, as Vinnie Paz really does evolve as a rapper and branches out to some more emotional and conscious subject material, while Stoop the Enemy of Mankind, who we may just hear from later on this list, turns in one of the best sampling and production jobs of his illustrious career. We head back to New York for our 6th entry on this list, which is the debut album of underground legend J-Live, The Best Part. Recorded mainly in the late 90s prior to J-Live getting dropped from a record deal he had in place at the time, this album features some incredible production from a few very big names, which was very indicative of kind of the rallying that was taking place around underground hip-hop in the late 90s and early 2000s. And while some of the production credits, as we'll get into here, are pretty impressive, J-Live has an incredible lyrical gift that is on full display on pretty much every track. So this is a bit of a behemoth of an album when it comes to length, clocking in at just about 75 minutes. So while that can get a little bit frustrating, especially towards the album's second half, J-Live gives us just an unbelievable performance for the entire duration of this album. Standouts include the furious Don't Play, the fun Vampire Hunter J, and the conscious RAGE, though pretty much all tracks on this thing are of a similar high quality. So as I mentioned, there's some legendary producers on this thing, as you have names like Pete Rock on Kick It to the Beat, Prince Paul on Wax Paper, DJ Premier on the title track, and a young 88 Keys on a handful of other tracks. It was clear that the underground was ready to get behind J-Live in the late 90s. I mean, just look at the roster of producers on this thing and the potential that these producers had identified. J-Live gives us just an undeniable collection of underground hip-hop classics on The Best Part. One kind of starts to wonder if J-Live maybe would have been a bigger name if he hadn't lost his record deal, but I guess we'll never know. One thing's for sure in my book, he's not a huge name, and I really do think that he should be bigger. So The Best Part, which is J-Live's best album in my book, easily makes this list as underrated. For number 5, we're going to go right back to the Chicago underground, as apparently there was a flourishing scene there in the early to mid 2000s. I think this next artist may be just about as obscure as Vakill, but they are one of the most infectious jazz rap collectives that I've ever heard. So as we enter the top 5, we're going to focus on the debut self-titled album by Typical Cats, which was a 5-man crew consisting of 3 MCs MCs and 2 producers and DJs. So their debut, which was released in early 2001, is an absolute clinic in underground jazz rap, as pretty much every sample cooked up by producers DJ Natural and Kid Kanish is lifted directly from jazz records. Take for instance the winding piano loop on the song Snake Oil, which is one of the most enjoyable songs on this album. Now, even though the production is a huge standout lyrically, this album is no slouch, as the rappers are all very skilled, but one in particular, Quell, blows the listener away with some rapid-fire abstract lyrics on songs in particular like Colloquialisms. Quasar and Denizen Kane are the other 2 MCs that shine on songs like Any Day, Natural Causes, and It Won't Stop. But perhaps the most enjoyable moment on this record actually exists on the cassette-only version, as the wonderfully jazzy Thin Red Line talks about parallel stories of a day in the life of the MCs as they commute to downtown Chicago to get to the local radio station to participate in an open mic. Maybe you haven't heard Typical Cats, or maybe you have heard them, but if you haven't and you enjoy conscious underground jazz rap, where the MCs really aren't afraid to step up and show their skills, then this album is for you. This seems like a bit of a lost Chicago classic that I'm hoping that I can just keep alive a little bit by highlighting it here. Alright, as we get closer to the top here, number 4 takes us to Western Canada, in particular to the city of Edmonton, Alberta. Not exactly a hip-hop hotbed, Edmonton was the home in 2005 of a rapper by the name of Cadence Weapon, who came onto the scene with his album that year, Breaking Kayfabe, which I think is, in retrospect, extremely underrated, although it did get its flowers when it came out. The album was actually a finalist for the inaugural Polaris Award in 2006, which is an award that focuses solely on Canadian-based artists, so this did generate a little bit of buzz. The album was celebrated for its glitchy soundscapes, which featured a lot of 8-bit components, which is a tactic that got somewhat popular in hip-hop in the second half of the 2000s and into the early 2010s. Whether Breaking Kayfabe was a pioneer of this style is debatable at best, but just know that this is some well-executed, glitchy, experimental hip-hop. Cadence Weapon did produce the entirety of the album, so he's pretty much responsible for everything you hear on here, verbally and sonically. The album starts off with a nice 1-2 punch of Oliver Square and Sharks, which are 2 electronic-based hip-hop songs with some thoughtful and also boastful poetry. The 4th track, Blackhand, is actually one of my top 100 played songs in my music library. I think it may even be top 50 by now, as I can't get enough of that chaotic sampling in the verses with some of Cadence Weapon's sharp wordplay, and then there's just like this smooth, melodic, chilled out chorus that I love. So while Blackhand's my favorite, this formula is kind of used throughout the rest of the album as well, and results in other awesome tracks like Diamond Cutter and Lisa's Spider. So if you're looking for something a little more maybe experimental and glitchy, say along the lines of Flying Lotus, then this album is for you. So since Breaking Kayfabe came out, Cadence Weapon has really built his reputation as a very accomplished poet both on and off the mic, and you can really see the first indications of a great wordsmith on this album. Breaking Kayfabe is a really cool combination of different musical styles from a unique, talented rapper from a very, very unlikely place. Into the top 3. Here we go. We're getting into some seriously underrated albums in my book. So Detroit, Michigan is the scene for the number 3 album. We'll go back to the beginning of the decade for the second album from a duo that I absolutely love, and that is Binary Star, and the album is Masters of the Universe. This is a long album with just a ton of material, another 70+ minute runtime, but some of it is among the best hip-hop I've ever heard from the underground side of things. The duo consists of rappers Senem Silla and 1Below, who actually do sound pretty similar in their voice and delivery, but they do manage to put together a pretty awesome album here. Now, out there in the music world, there are a number of albums that kind of peak early with their best track, and this is the case for Masters of the Universe, as I think Reality Check is one of the best hip-hop songs I've ever heard. I mean, that piano loop is just fantastic. While this is the best song on the album and it does introduce the MCs and their verbal skills, which are very, very potent, the duo do stay pretty consistent throughout the rest of the album with songs like Conquistadors, Slang Blade, New Hip Hop, and the fun, creepy story told on Wolfman Jack leading the way. Both parts 1 and 2 of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings are a little more serious and conscious, and 1Below and Senem Silla do bring a very distinct conscious flair to the album as a whole. Now, beats are done by a few different producers, with 1Below actually handling production duties on about half the album. The quality across this entire 73-minute runtime is actually quite remarkable. These guys had a fresh, conscious sound with some forward-thinking storytelling and some enjoyable rhyme schemes. They come correct with a few battle raps and manage to keep the album fun, but do keep kind of a serious aura throughout. The elements all come together perfectly here, and while this is an album that a lot of underground hip-hop heads still do celebrate to this day, when you compare it to a lot of the other stuff coming out around the year 2000, you'll realize just how high quality this is. So I really did go back and forth with my top 2 albums as far as which one was going to be number 2, which one was going to be number 1. I eventually settled on an album at number 2 from an artist who came up in the mainstream and who actually had some pretty major success in those first few years of his career. So that rapper is Canibus, who came out as a very strong lyrical contender who even had a publicized beef with both LL Cool J and Eminem before kind of having to step step back in the industry, as it seems like he may have been blacklisted due to the beef with such high-profile names. After 4 fairly successful albums between 1998 and 2002, even with his reputation kind of not being so good by 2002, Canibus made a distinct shift to the underground for his 2003 album, which is the number 2 album on my list, Rip the Jacker. So to me, this is kind of wild. 5 years prior to Rip the Jacker, Canibus was working alongside big names like LL Cool J, Wyclef Jean, Common, Slick Rick, Big Pun, Noriega. And now here in 2003, he's working exclusively with Jedi Mind Tricks producer Stoop the Enemy of Mankind. So needless to say, Canibus's sound had changed pretty drastically in those few years. So I told you we were going to be hearing about Stoop again, who has a very distinct production style that actually fit Canibus's lyrical style on this album perfectly, as Stoop employed this sample chorus heavy approach that featured sometimes bright and sometimes menacing sample chops that fit Canibus's new dark jaded persona pretty damn well. On Rip the Jacker, Canibus dives more into this disgruntled militant persona and made this album a concept record that actually showed the world through the eyes of 2 alter egos as well as Canibus himself. Also, an important fact is that Canibus had enlisted to join the military prior to this album coming out, as it seems like he believed that there was no more place for him in the hip-hop industry, so he figured he would go out with a bang. And we do hear references to his upcoming military service, and the album art shows this as well. And this sort of departure from normal civilian life definitely adds to the album's dark undertones. So in my eyes, everything comes together perfectly here. The beats, the rhymes, the atmosphere, and a sometimes mythical, mysterious aura. Canibus and Spartacus feature devastatingly hard drums with tentative melodic sample chops by Stoop, and feature Canibus actually spitting some of the deadliest bars of his career. Mid-album songs like No Return show more of a relaxing reggae vibe, and Showtime at the Gallows features an ironically upbeat sample. It's the final track, Poet Laureate 2, that is one of Canibus's best lyrical performances ever. The song was the last on the album and can essentially be interpreted as Canibus's swan song at the time, believing he was going into the military for the foreseeable future and kind of saying goodbye to hip-hop. It turns out that Canibus's military stint was not that long, and he was right back to hip-hop within like a year or two. But on Poet Laureate 2, he blesses us with 6.5 minutes straight of rapping over some of Stoop's most dramatic beats, and yes, I do say beats plural, as there are some awesome beat switches on this thing. Rip the Jacker is a really interesting project that I just kind of randomly stumbled across at the record store about 2 weeks after it came out. I was kind of a Canibus fan at the time, even though he was sort of a laughingstock within the hip-hop industry by 2003. I bought the album without even hearing it. It's got a badass cover too, so I guess the 15-year-old me was really enraptured by that. I'm glad that I bought it. I'm glad that I gave Canibus a second chance, as this was one of the most important records that I was listening to during some of my early high school years. If you pick this album up, if you decide to give it a spin, forget everything you know about the mainstream Canibus, the guy who battled LL Cool J and Eminem. This is a totally different vibe, but it does have that same infamous skill set that at one point had everybody thinking that Canibus was hip-hop's next big thing. If you know me, and if you know this channel, you'll know that I love Queensbridge hip-hop more than anything. I'm a big Mobb Deep fan. I think Nas is the greatest rapper of all time. I included a Cormega album earlier on this list, and I even named Capone and Noriega's The War Report my number 1 underrated 90s hip-hop album. Well, guess what? I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna name a Queensbridge album the number 1 most underrated hip-hop album, this time of the 2000s. Infamous Mobb is a trio consisting of Godfather, Gambino, and Ty Nitty, and the group made their debut on the first track of Mobb Deep's 1996 album Hell on Earth, although Ty Nitty did appear actually on the last track of Mobb Deep's 1995 classic The Infamous. The group would appear on later Mobb Deep albums as well, but in 2002 they released their first solo album, Special Edition, which I am officially naming my number 1 most underrated 2000s hip-hop album. So why is this number 1? Why is this the most underrated hip-hop album of the 2000s? Well, for one, it's an album that's not really well known far beyond real deep Queensbridge and New York City hip-hop heads. Number 2, it's a fantastic clinic in that dirty, gritty street rap that I have always loved. Number 3, it's Mobb Deep adjacent, as it features appearances from Prodigy, Havoc, Big Noid, and also features beats from Havoc. And number 4, about half of the album was produced by a young Alchemist. And if you're a fan of this channel, you know how much I love Alchemist's work, and I think he's one of the greatest producers of all time. Alchemist actually gets things kicked off with the intro and the first track, I Am 3, where the trio immediately bring the listener down into that street-level grittiness with even some patriotic undertones, as we have to keep in mind this was released about 6 months after 9/11. The third track, Born Again, is an even more serious song that features Hostile from Queensbridge legendary group Screwball, before Killer Queens comes in with an iconic beat and guest appearances from both Prodigy and Big Noid. The fifth track, which is the title track, features a great crisp sample flip by The Alchemist with a fantastic piano beat, before the next song, Mobb Neighbors, blows the hinges off the door with just an incredibly explosive sample flip by, you guessed it, The Alchemist. Parts of the mid-album are a little bit slower in spots, but the morose, atmospheric We Don't Give a, which features Havoc on both the mic and the boards, really picks things up in the album's second half. But even though the album starts off extremely strong, I think the best tracks are at the end of the record, as the last 3 tracks in my eyes are legendary. The Alchemist sample flip and just another amazing piano beat on We Strive is just one of the best I've ever heard, while Cypress Hill's DJ Muggs actually comes in and does the penultimate track We Will Survive. But it's that last track, War, which comes in with just these brutal drums and this incredible piano sample done by Havoc. It's just one of the saddest, most angry, most desperate songs I've ever heard, with just some really gritty lyrics that just personify why I love Infamous Mobb and why I love Queensbridge hip-hop. I have to say that War is one of my most listened to songs of all time, and still 20 plus years later, I'm addicted to that piano loop. Honestly, I could go on for another hour about why I love this album, why I love Special Edition. It's a Queensbridge street relic, and by this time, Mobb Deep were about to really lose whatever little integrity they had left, as they were about to sign to G-Unit and their quality was going to dip further following the album Infamy. But on Special Edition, their spirit is kind of kept alive by Ty Nitty Godfather and Gambino. And overall, to me, this is one of the most underrated albums ever, hip-hop or otherwise. Special Edition is the quintessential example of a diamond in the rough, and I really hope that some of you who have not heard this album really go give it a spin. That's it. That's a wrap. That's my list. As always, I love to discuss, so leave me a comment on what you liked, what you agreed with, what you wish was on this list, what hip-hop albums you think are underrated from the 2000s. I love to discuss, and I love to hear your opinions, so please feel free to leave me a comment below, and it would always help if you subscribe to the channel. Just like my 90s list, this was one hell of a fun project, and I thank you for sharing the journey with me.